Great. Well, yeah, let's jump in. Like I said, I'm eager to hand the floor over to the true experts, but by quick introduction, my name is Adam Smart. I'm the communications officer at the Melanoma Research Foundation. I've been with the organization for about 6 years, which means that I've had a front row seat for just about half of what tremendous things Curom has accomplished and what this community has grown into and done together. And the people on the call today, I think, were a very large part of a lot of it. So very happy that you're here. Thank you for joining us, and really look forward to what I hope is going to be a really encouraging and sort of retrospective conversation about, what the past 10 years have been for our organization and for the OM community in general, and perhaps more importantly, what lies ahead, what we're going to accomplish in the next 10 years and beyond. So by means of quick introductions, and I want to allow each of you to give a more proper introduction, but today we're joined by Dr. Sarah Selig, who many of you know. She is the co-founder and director of the Curom Initiative. We have Dr. Keith Flaherty from Massachusetts General Hospital Cancer Center, who's been closely involved with a lot of the important work and cutting edge research that we've been doing over the years. And then we have Anne-Marie Montijo, who is a longtime member of our community, and we're so glad to have you. And I know you're a familiar face to many on the call today. And then Nigel, Deacon, who has also been with us for quite a while and has really taken our work and expanded it. And we're going to touch a little more on that, on some of the work you're doing up in Canada on that regard. And then I know at least a couple of us have some canine companions, so we might have some surprise guests today. So I apologize if that happens, but it's always good to have a little surprise. So with that, let's just jump right in. And if I can pull my notes here, sorry. Let's start at the beginning. And the beginning, Sarah, I think really begins with you. So I know the story is perhaps somewhat familiar to many, but for those who may be joining us for the first time this meeting. So today, Curom is an initiative that it reaches patients around the country and across the globe. We funded $2.1 million in research, and we're really doing work that is advancing the field. But the origins of the initiative were much smaller and closer to home. So can you tell me about the events that led to the creation of what we know now as the Curom Initiative?
Sure. And for those of you who were just in the last panel, it's sort of emotional to transition from that panel to this one. So sorry, just bear with me for a minute, but I think it's just amazing to see all the progress in the field. We just, spent like 20 minutes longer than we were scheduled to spend on the last panel of clinical trials in the uveal melanoma space, because there are that many trials to review and that much to discuss. And when my husband Greg was diagnosed in 2006, I think right around the same time, Anne-Marie, that you were diagnosed, that was not the case. And Greg and I were in our early 30s at the time, and I was a fourth-year medical student and had never heard of ocular melanoma before. I didn't know you could get melanoma in your eye. And Greg came back from a run, he was out on a jog, and he complained about some visual disturbances. And in his early 30s, never needing glasses, he hadn't ever had a dilated eye exam. And so, as many people can relate, it was very fast progression to where his eye tumor was being treated. And we just felt very alone, very isolated. We were getting information about the disease from his doctors, but when we asked one of his doctors if they could put us in touch with any other patients who had ever dealt with this before, they didn't want to. And the reason that we were told that they wouldn't connect us with other patients was because outcomes were so variable. They didn't want us to get scared. So Greg and I were going through this, having never heard of this disease, not being able to access any other patients who had ever been through this before. There was no website we could go to with information. So we were quickly trying to read the medical literature to try and distill and understand as much information as we could. And we just felt really alone and isolated and scared. And, you know, being so young, we didn't have any friends or peers who had ever really experienced a difficult diagnosis like this before. So we just, it was hard to find the support that I think would have been helpful for us at the time, getting through those early days.
Thank you very much. So if I can, I'd love to ask sort of a similar question to you, Anne-Marie, and Nigel as well. Can you tell me about your experiences at the time you were diagnosed? What was available to you in terms of treatment options or support resources?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I had a very different experience than Sarah and Greg did. I was treated in New York City. And one of the things my ocular oncologist did was ask me if I wanted to talk to another patient who had been through this. And he connected me to somebody immediately. Took me a few weeks probably to call that person, but that was, I think, one of the keys for me. He also had an online forum, I forget what it was called at the time, that connected patients. I don't remember how you were able to search for it and whatnot, but that was also kind of a lifesaver for me, being able to talk to other patients. One of the patients that he connected me to actually came to the hospital the day of my first surgery, and actually met my family and my friends before she met me. And then when they were allowed up to visit me, I got to kind of meet her face to face for the first time. She'd been treated about 3 years prior to me, and you know, we are still very, very good friends to this day. And that to me, you know, besides obviously life-saving surgery and treatment, has really been the lifeline for many people. You know, the community kind of developed new platforms, you know, and eventually, you know, we've just come together as a community. And I agree, you know, that if it wasn't for Sarah and Greg really starting this 10 years ago, I don't think the scientific community would be where they are as far as the communication. It's been, you know, an incredible 10 years. But I was diagnosed around the same time, I think a few months before, you know, before Greg.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's interesting. I was diagnosed with primary disease in 2010 and metastasis in 2012, which spans that period when Curom emerged. I live in Canada, and my experience was more similar, I think, to Greg's and Sarah's, where I knew nothing about the disease. I had great difficulty finding anybody else who had it. I had great difficulty finding information about the disease. I did find that online groups were forming in the States, so I joined all of those. And that was my first contact with other people with the same condition. I became friendly with some of them, and when I was able to, I would attend the conferences which were beginning to be organized in the States. And that was an extraordinary experience to, you know, it's one thing to chat with somebody online, it's another thing to stand in a room with 50, 100, or 150 other patients. And that was what was starting to happen, and that's what gave me the greatest hope that we could make progress in all kinds of areas. Curom had spelled out a really clear vision by that time of what they wanted to achieve. And over time, I developed the courage to try and learn from them and do something similar in Canada. And so Ocular Canada now reaches out to Canadian patients. I set up a Facebook group and thought, well, it would be really great if we could get 5 people in this group or 10 people in this group. But as of this week, we have 110 in the group, which is amazing for, you know, a country that has a much smaller OM community than the States. We formed under the auspices of the Save Your Skin Foundation, which is a melanoma advocacy group in Canada that has grown enormously over a slightly longer period of time, from about 2006, 2007. And they have been very kind to us. And that mirrors very much what I learned from Sarah and from Curom. This is one way of building a support network for patients. So I've gone from being very alone with my disease, being told that follow-up, there was no point in follow-up with surveillance because there was nothing could be done to help me, to surviving for a long time with metastatic disease, living well and increasingly happily. And so the 10 years to me have been just amazing.
Okay, thank you both. This was a good look back. If we can sort of ask a similar question, Dr. Flaherty, what was the state of OM research and treatment 10 years ago? And you know, what were the primary challenges that your field faced?
Yeah, well, I mean, the state of ocular melanoma research 10 years ago was, I was going to start with the word chaotic, but that would imply that there was a lot going on, and there wasn't. I mean, what was the case is that it was siloed. I mean, so in other words, where there was research, it was happening at individual cancer centers, and you know, the degree of emphasis varied depending on you know, how much ocular melanoma was represented within the melanoma population. So, you know, in the general population, it's 1% of all melanoma. And so if you had research programs and clinical programs that were kind of cast as melanoma programs more generally, then it was common around the world that ocular melanoma just didn't capture attention within any one group of investigators at an institution because of the 1% number. That said, there are some centers that disproportionately see vastly more ocular melanoma cases. And this is really most notably if they're proximate to the care providers who treat primary ocular melanoma, so ophthalmologists with expertise in that treatment. And that really then accounts for programs that, you know, that see many more. I'm just using Mass General, my own center, as an example. We're right across the alleyway from the Mass Eye and Ear Infirmary, which happens to be, you know, a place where many patients come to have their primary tumors treated. And so as a consequence for us, 10% of our melanoma population have ocular melanoma. And when I say our, I'm referring now to, you know, the Mass General side, where we take care of patients, particularly with, well, significant concern for recurrence or who have recurrence. And of course, 10 years ago, when we still did not have a standard test to be able to discern those who had a worrisome outcome from those who had a good prognosis, we put everybody in that category of, you know, concern for the possibility of recurrence. So we basically just systematically saw all of those patients. So like I said, about 10% of our practice. But if you just consider that range, 1% to 10%, I think that helps you understand a little bit of why there were varying degrees of attention to the problem. But even at places where ocular melanoma patients were well represented, it was just a sort of silo I would guess maybe call it cottage industry of sorts to do, an individual clinical trial that might take several years to arrive at an answer. And generally speaking, not a lot of attention to the unique molecular makeup of ocular melanoma. I mean, these are really the discoveries that were happening at the time. Before this group put their shoulder into, kind of the advocacy and policy work that got ocular melanoma on the Cancer Genome Atlas landscape, like allowing us to really, create this really kind of big quantum leap in molecular understanding of ocular melanoma. There were just a few groups that were working on the sort of genetic alterations or mutations that might give rise to ocular melanoma. Those were seminal discoveries that happened in the late 2000s. So like just entering into the period that we're talking about. But that alone wasn't giving us a lot of foothold or traction. So that's the state as it was 10 years ago, which is to say that we really didn't have what I would call a field. In other words, that's a community. That's a set of constituents, doctors, researchers, patient advocates, let's say companies who might have an interest in diagnostics or therapeutics, National Cancer Institute, right? So all of the entities that we point to when we talk about cutaneous melanoma, for example, and like what it is that constitutes a field of cutaneous melanoma, we just didn't have that, and we certainly didn't have the connections or the continuity at all. And I'll just finish with the final point, which I think the patient community is well aware of, because patients who've been affected with ocular melanoma live this. Ocular melanoma patients, would tend to be assessed and managed for their primary ocular melanoma at centers with, ophthalmologic oncology expertise. And that may or may not then have sort of included or carried over into concerns of the risk of metastatic disease or spread outside of the eye. And so you had kind of a discontinuity in care, where patients, were being treated for their primary tumor. As Nigel just said, the state of the field back then was that there wasn't even consensus that it was worthwhile to follow patients for the possibility of spread elsewhere. And so there wasn't even necessarily a pass off in all cases of patients who had undergone quote unquote definitive treatment of their primary tumors to those like myself as a medical oncologist who would be concerned with this possibility of spread elsewhere, detecting it early, and then trying to do something to benefit patients, admitting that we didn't have anything at the time, but we always could have considered clinical trials and did, even when we didn't have ideas that were quite as sharp as the ones we have now.
So you mentioned sorry, Sarah, did you want to?
Can I just add one thing on to what Keith just mentioned, which just from the patient perspective. And again, I'm just thinking back to the session that we just had, where there's this wide range of clinical trials that's currently not only open to ocular melanoma patients, but actually trials specific to ocular melanoma patients. That, a year after Greg was diagnosed with his primary eye tumor, he was diagnosed with metastatic disease. We were told he had about 6 months to live. And he, at the time when we were looking for clinical trials, not only were there no clinical trials specific to ocular melanoma, but the clinical trials that were at the time open to melanoma patients actually had exclusion criteria for ocular melanoma patients. So I just want to emphasize Keith's point a little bit more, that from the patient side, you're being told that there are trials for melanoma patients, but that excludes you. And that's just, I think, a huge juxtaposition to the session that we just came out of, and just to kind of emphasize kind of on the other side of the exam table, Keith's points of like what it felt like to be sitting in that chair and hearing that.
Yeah, Sarah, that actually reminds me of the conversation we had with Dr. Orloff earlier this week, talking about the difference in clinical care, where, only a handful of years ago, if I can paraphrase her, she said, that initial conversation post-diagnosis with a patient was a very simple one. It wasn't positive, but it was very short. This is what it looks like. And it was so enlightening to hear that now she said that it's a much more complicated, discussion. It's, when you're asked, what are my options? It's, well, sit down. This perhaps could take a while. So you have option A, B, and just those continue to expand. So just to hear that to me was incredibly encouraging. Dr. Flaherty, you mentioned the Cancer Genome Atlas, and Sarah, you were closely involved in getting that, getting OM included in that. Can either or both of you sort of explain a little more about that project and why ocular melanoma's inclusion in that was so important?
Yeah, I'll maybe start and then pass it to Sarah, just in terms of kind of what was so unique about the Cancer Genome Atlas project. So NCI funded effort in close collaboration with research centers who had over the years accumulated tumor samples. In this case, for ocular melanoma, as many people know, ocular melanoma in many instances is treated without a tissue diagnosis. Historically that was essentially always the case. Only when we had the gene expression profile diagnostic test emerge did even a quote unquote fine needle aspirate become a standard. But to be able to interrogate deeply tumors in the way that was being done in the Cancer Genome Atlas, one needed to have a significant amount of tumor material from each individual patient to be able to so-called sequence the DNA, the RNA, and even look at other molecular components beyond that. But in particular, the nature of the Cancer Genome Atlas was to perform comprehensive genomic sequencing to understand the genetic alterations or architecture of the genome in cancer cells. So again, this is pre-inclusion of ocular melanoma. And then with the RNA expression, one can actually get additional insights in terms of the sort of aspects of cancer biology that are driving a given cancer to be in the first place. And so these the combination of the two types of data we now know in retrospect really were absolutely foundational for therapeutic breakthroughs in many cancer types. And while we didn't know that at the time that we didn't know exactly what the deliverables were going to be for the TCGA broadly, we knew that this was a really unique opportunity in terms of trying to just shine a bright light on this unique type of cancer and go far beyond what had happened before, which was really just focusing on individual genetic alterations. So forgive the jargon, but the seminal discovery of the so-called GNAQ and GNA11 mutations, and then separately BAP1, BAP1. Those were big moments for the field, but that's kind of a blinders on, kind of strategy, which is really indicative of how cancer research had been happening for 20 years before in terms of understanding these genetic alterations. So to really widen the lens and just consider, across literally every molecule in the cell, what's different about these cancers from other cancers and from normal cells. That was the value proposition. But I'll just pass it to Sarah because, the unique challenge was basically trying to find collaborators who actually had tumors that could be subjected to this type of analysis, which had to be more than just even a fine needle aspirate.
Yeah, thanks, Keith, for that. I think the challenge presented to us was that the Cancer Genome Atlas project had already prioritized some of the most common cancers, and that was moving forward. And then this opportunity arose for them to include a certain number, but a limited number of rare cancers, rare tumors. And if we could provide them the tissue samples that they needed by a certain date, then uveal melanoma would be included in that. And so really it was us organizing a global group of researchers who had these tissue samples that Keith is mentioning, and would be willing to share them and collaborate, because again, as Keith said, a lot of the research had really been done in silos, and tissue is so important to the research, and we're still struggling to find a way to meaningfully be able to collaborate around different tissue samples and different models that can be used in the lab for research. And so sharing tissue, while it's a very important part of research and advancing research, it's also challenging to do, one, because of international boundaries, we found out, and two, because it really, you do need to build trust between researchers to share this tissue and to have a shared vision of what the research is going to look like, to use this sort of precious commodity, if you will, to try and answer these questions. So we went to work very quickly and brought together a very collaborative group of ocular melanoma researchers. It turns out actually that I think a lot of the silos that existed early on in the field were not for any lack of people wanting to collaborate and work together, but difficulty in having those channels that allowed people to do this. Because when you're working day and night to treat patients and to research this disease, to be able to communicate with others takes a lot of effort in and of itself. And so I think a lot of the added value of Curom over the years has been to help build those bridges and build those communication channels for people, which is really what I think happened with the Cancer Genome Atlas project, is that we helped build some of those connections, and then people very willingly were excited to participate and share these tissue samples. And so a lot of them had to be bigger than the fine needle aspirates that Keith was saying. So we needed to find people who had samples of, like, when a patient had an eye removed or nucleation, and then in some cases matching metastatic disease to be able to answer even more complex questions about connections between primary disease and metastatic disease, to really help us get a better understanding of the disease as a whole. So I think we had like 6 weeks to get 50 samples from around the world. And, we were really grateful to all of the researchers who were willing to share in this initiative to make that happen. And so ocular melanoma in the end did become one of the limited rare cancers included in the TCGA, which I think was a really exciting step for the field.
So I'd love to open the floor to everybody for this question, or a prompt rather. So from the beginning, OM patients and caregivers have been at this, truly the center of everything we do, from support groups to patient meetings like this, and I promise we will one day return to in-person gatherings, to incorporating the patient perspective in the grant review process, which was, in a lot of ways something that hadn't been done before, to even the creation of the Vision Registry. So from both the patient and caregiver perspective, as well as the physician and researcher, why is that focus and dedication on patient centricity so important to the work that's being done?
I'll jump in on that one. I mean, this is the easiest way to build from what Sarah and I were just talking about to this point is to say that if you throw all of the technological firepower available at the problem, if you will, in terms of trying to understand, the molecular makeup of ocular melanoma, in the absence of understanding the unique journey / course that those very same patients undertook. So in other words, how did they fare with their disease? Were they cured? Were they not cured? If they were cured, that would be with primary treatment alone, of course, of the primary ocular melanoma. But if their melanoma recurred, how did it behave? So as Sarah and I used to talk about, years ago, Greg's ocular melanoma behaved, a bit differently than the typical person with distant spread, but not completely unique. I mean, I would just ballpark it and say about 10% of ocular melanoma patients who I've seen over 20 years kind of fit into that group in terms of the nature of the spread of their disease. And so just even starting with that, right? If you were to say, okay, well, let's imagine then there's a 90% and a 10%. Well, if you don't apply that lens to the problem in terms of then trying to make sense of the molecular information, you're completely lost, right? And so you need, you not only need to communicate, the importance of this, but you then need buy-in of patients to share their experience. obviously, in more recent years, it becomes then increasingly critical to understand, well, what treatments did people receive? Liver-directed therapy, immunotherapies that were initially approved on the basis of cutaneous melanoma data, but where the FDA, at least in the US, approved them broadly across all melanoma types with no evidence in ocular melanoma at the time. And so there again, you need to overlay, that data, but that comes down to the individual patient, right? This is a matter of patients being our partners in research and being willing to have their experience, their outcomes, basically, joined with others to empower these types of discoveries. I mean, and this is how we're going to accelerate and continue to make progress after some initial inroads now in terms of therapies. I can point to cutaneous melanoma and tell you that 10 years ago, when we quote unquote lifted off the ground there, the big accelerator, particularly for some therapies more than others, was the partnership we had with patients where major centers like ours, we had patients who were so generous in being willing to undergo biopsies of their cancer before, during, and following treatment for research purposes only, right? So basically to essentially put themselves in, modest harm, but still in harm's way in terms of undergoing biopsies for that purpose. I mean, what a powerful example of the way in which our patient community really, is it's not only like, they're central to, they are the purpose of, it's kind of like the be all and end all of the work that we do. So it's so easy, for me to, talk about the gaps in knowledge at a molecular level, but you understand my point about, what this is all about. And if you don't have the engagement of the patient community in this research, you're talking about, complete inability to accelerate once you've got a molecular understanding or a quote unquote foot in the door with a therapy that actually moves the needle.
Can we invite either Anne-Marie or Nigel, if you'd like to share, why is it important to you that, you're so closely involved in this work?
Thanks, Adam. Just in the 15 years since I was diagnosed, just the change, and it seems like exponentially at times, how much is available, to patients now than there was, 10 and 15 years ago. But what's also apparent to me has been that there are still ocular oncologists and retina specialists out there who are not doing surveillance, after the initial treatment. And, it kind of blows my mind that that's where we're at still, 10 and 15 years later with, organizations out there advocating and patients coming together, that patients are literally, having to really advocate for themselves to get abdominal MRIs. Some doctors are not ordering anything, some are ordering blood work only. And really to get people to advocate to have those. Just as an example, I've had my twice yearly MRIs for many years, and after, I guess it was 6 or 7 years after my initial diagnosis, they noticed something growing on my pancreas. So as that was monitored, it was finally said, we really should remove this. We don't know exactly what it is. It could be nothing, it could be something. And I had 40% of the tail of my pancreas removed and my spleen. And thankfully, all reports came back, negative. But, fast forward 8 years later and my father's diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So, I really feel that, these abdominal MRIs have saved my life in many ways, and I have them annually now. But you have to advocate. You have to be loud. You have to, take that stance and advocate for yourself. It's imperative. It's life-saving.
And from my point of view, I've gone from having a blood test to explaining to my oncologist what I really need in terms of surveillance. I was the one who had to find a way to treatment. It wasn't obvious and it wasn't suggested by oncologists. So I've come a long way through learning, what best practice is, attending conferences, working with other patients and other patient groups. I would just like to say that one of the most exciting things we've done over the past year or two together is to build stronger links with patient advocacy organizations in the UK, in Australia, and in Ireland. And we all share a language, and that's a wonderful thing. But it's hardly enough, given that it's a rare cancer, the numbers in any one country will always be small. I mean, the US probably has the largest UV population of anywhere just because of the size of its population. But if you think of 7,000 or 8,000 diagnoses a year globally, that's no longer a small family. And so when we work together and when we speak together, I think more people will listen to us.
And Adam, maybe I can just add a couple thoughts to that. I think that individual advocacy, Anne-Marie, that you were talking about, and Keith, that you referenced, I think like early on for Greg and me, I mean, I remember sitting on our living room floor and having these papers all over the floor and trying to like figure out what treatments were being offered where, and reaching out to different people. And we were advocating for Greg and for our family, like very clearly, like I was not going to lose this person I loved so much. Like we were, working as hard as we could. But it became very clear that that advocacy could happen at multiple levels. And so while we were advocating for Greg and our family, we felt that we could turn that advocacy into advocating for the community as a whole. And I think that one of the things that I've been so impressed by, patients in this space is that I watch Anne-Marie and Nigel and others advocate at these multiple levels simultaneously. So meeting with doctors about themselves and their own case. And then, through support groups and through these discussion boards, like offering support and advice to, other patients going through what they've been through already. And then, through Curom, helping to raise research funds through our different, fundraising events, or helping to advocate at that level, going to the FDA with us to advocate for, during the rare disease listening session that we had 2 years ago. So, I think I've been so inspired just to see this advocacy at all these different levels at the same time. And I think that the advocacy at the larger community level, as Keith was saying earlier, necessarily needs to be informed by that individual experience. And patients know best what they need. And I think with, the Vision Registry, we're trying to kind of bring all of that together, as Nigel said, with the global perspective and working, with different countries to bring everyone in together and to bring those perspectives together, to bring that patient perspective in there, to understand what does that experience look like and what are patient priorities, because we need to align the molecular learnings that Keith has, outlined so well with the patient experience. And I think that goes back to some of what, Rich, Sapna, and Marlena were saying in the last session. When you have these different options, now we get to say like, okay, well, it isn't just good enough that this drug targets this, molecular piece of the disease, but like, what does it do for the patient quality of life? And now we have options. So it isn't sort of like, well, this is the only option, so you're going to have to deal with whatever side effects you get. It's like, oh, no, like patients actually get to have a voice in this. And, that's been the case, and that's been important all along. But now I think we're getting to see that in a really meaningful and important way at the next level because of all the advances.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sarah, you actually touched on the next question I want to ask, or was going to ask, by just talking about the Vision Registry, knowing that we spoke about it more in depth earlier, but just the importance of it being patient-powered, and sort of the type of information that's collected that sets it apart from perhaps other research initiatives that may exist. Why is vision historic in its nature, and sort of being driven by the patient and caregiver perspective? And I'd love to open this up to everyone if we could.
Well, I'm happy to start us off, but I feel like I've spoken a lot about vision, so I'd be very happy also, Nigel and Anne Marie, for you to step in. But I'll say that I think, just adding on to the couple comments I just made, and maybe first just tying it back to Greg, I think the very first the very first scientific meeting, I guess, that Greg and I organized was before we founded Curom, actually. And Greg stood up in front of these researchers who had taken a risk and flown in from around the world to come together and talk about uveal melanoma in this global setting for the first time. And Greg stood up, and from his heart and what he felt, as an obligation as a patient representative in that room. And he said, I encourage you, I deplore you to, think about yourselves as a team. Don't think about yourselves as separated by an ocean, as separated by institutions, but think about yourselves as a team, come together, be innovative, be creative, and don't accept the status quo, on behalf of myself and my family and all the patients in this field. And I think that with the Vision Registry, we're doing that. We're bringing together all the different stakeholders. We're bringing together researchers and clinicians and patients, and we're breaking down those silos and those barriers, and we're bringing in information that's patient, driven and patient-centric information to help us find a cure for this disease. So I think, I think having the information be inputted by patients themselves is really important, because if you get information from a single institution, or a single perspective, that can tell you a lot. And there are lots of different registries with a lot of different goals, all very important. I think the Vision Registry in particular, it follows the patient. It doesn't follow one treatment. It doesn't follow one institution, but it puts together the whole patient journey. And in doing so, we're hoping that it will help us unlock clues to be able to find effective treatments and ultimately a cure for this disease.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add to that, I remember distinctly at the Atlanta symposium, talking about what we needed. And here we are, having launched the Vision Registry. It took time, but to do something right, it does take time. And just encouraging everybody to enter the data. It's critical, because the reality is that the questions that you're asking in the Vision Registry are not being asked by the individual centers. They're not being asked by the individual doctors for their own research and information. They're taking the basics of tumor size, age, et cetera, but you guys are really getting into, and the registry is getting into, the little aspects, the other aspects of our lives. That could be so critical to finding out a lot more information.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that, this is a numbers problem in a way where now that we do have options, basically the limitation of single center data is going to be that much more apparent, in that there'll be so many permutations of how patients are offered therapy and pursue them, and individual doctors will have their, what I'll call, biases in terms of what therapies to prioritize, and individual patients will have their own reception, perspective, and choice in terms of what they choose to follow. And what I'm getting at is that those influences are really hard to sort out. If you're then to try to understand if a patient, if many patients started, for example, at the time of recurrence with tebentafusp as a first treatment, And then let's say, for many, it does not work as well as we would like, and they move on then to liver-directed therapy. And they get, PD-1, maybe CTLA-4 antibody, either alone or together. But imagine different sequences and permutations of that, right? And then overlay the point that I made before, which is that some doctors and patients are choosing those therapies based on certain priorities or perceptions. And so you need a lot of data, is my point. You actually, you essentially need, first of all, to smooth out some of the choice-related issues, you need multi-center data, I mean, arguably global, but ultimately you need a lot of numbers if you're actually going to really start to be able to try to draw conclusions around, well, this sequence of therapies leads to the best outcome ultimately. Just to add to Anne-Marie's point about rising above the individual center level, here what we need to do is rise above the individual treatment, right? And this is where companies that develop therapies kind of can't do that work, right? I mean, they're kind of somewhat strapped in terms of continuing to do research around their own therapy and maybe its use in concert with something else, but not a sequence of 4 different therapies that are completely beyond the realm of a given clinical trial or the purview of any single company.
And just to add to that, I think to use Dr. Flaherty's example, about sequence of treatments, the Vision Registry has been designed in such an open and flexible way that there's the opportunity to create all kinds of new questionnaires and ways of storing information over time. I've started an interesting, I registered for the Vision Registry by pretending I was American, and not for the first time. There are advantages to doing that sometimes. But I have since been able to register with my own address, and I've started a conversation about tweaks to the registry that would make it easier to register, more digestible, maybe more relevant to the context in other countries and in other cultures. There are barriers there, some simple like spelling barriers between the US and Canada that should be incredibly easy to resolve. But how we talk about race is a very sensitive issue, and it does play into ocular melanoma because of the imbalance, the way it affects different populations. So we have to find a way that is culturally acceptable to all kinds of different groups about either skin color or race, however you want to pitch it. So those discussions need to happen. In addition, 1/3 of Canadians speak French as a first language. So we immediately have that barrier. How do we make sure that we can include all Canadian patients? And then just to pan that out over the globe, if there is a Northern European predominance of the disease, how about Russian, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, etc.? All of that has to happen, and I believe that it can. And then the other thing that I would add is that building on the possibility of integration between the Vision Registry and the Omni Registry, that's what will really get us places and take care of some of the issues that Dr. Flaherty identified.
And I just want to thank Nigel for all of his involvement and OcuMel Canada in the Vision Registry development. And as you mentioned, Nigel, providing feedback on how to improve the registry for our international collaborators. And we, really want that feedback. We're actively making those tweaks, as you say. And right now, the advocacy organizations you mentioned, we all share English as a language. But one of the reasons we chose Global Vision Technologies as the platform to host our registries, because there is the capability to translate the registry into other languages. And that is a goal of ours, just to your point. So just really appreciate all of your helpful suggestions as we adapt the registry for our global partners.
Okay, so I know we're running up on time, but just had sort of 2 questions that are very related to each other and to something sort of touched on a little earlier. So in the past 10 years in Curom's existence, it's been a transformative era in the cutaneous space. We've seen quite a few new treatments develop, research advances, but we haven't quite seen the same paradigm shift in OM quite yet. But I think there are reasons to believe that we are perhaps close. So what do you believe, and this, again, it's a question for everyone, from the research perspective to patient advocacy, what do you believe is being done or that will / needs to occur in the near future that will lead to that fundamental breakthrough?
Oh, I think I'll jump in again there. I think the obvious points for me are we need, this is really, I think, actually uniquely this group who's going to be the driver of this. We need to find a way to engage, motivate, incentivize entities in the private sector to develop what I would call bespoke therapies for ocular melanoma. And that could be molecularly targeted drugs. So in other words, trying to address specifically GNAQ and GNA11, which are not entirely exclusive to ocular melanoma, but are largely exclusive to ocular melanoma. So you're talking about a rare disease pair of drug targets, which 10 years ago when they were initially discovered as driving ocular melanoma, everyone in the field just looked at that, the molecular nature of those molecules. I mean, so that's the types of molecules that they are, and said, well, that'll be really hard to develop drugs against. Well, guess what? Now, fast forward to now, and those types of molecules are actually having drugs developed against them now somewhat routinely. Multiple companies going after them, but for more common targets and more common cancers. So we need to overcome that hump. But similarly for immunotherapy strategies, and by that I would say, if we're going to have more tebentafusp-like therapies where we kind of latch onto ocular melanoma cells and bring the immune system in, that's going to be potentially an example of bespoke therapies that may not be relevant for cutaneous melanoma or other cancers. And then cell therapies, similarly, which are being engineered wholesale nowadays for more common cancer types, but we may well need quite unique ones engineered for uveal melanoma. So that's going to really require much more engagement and sort of public-private partnership, and potentially enlisting the help and support of the National Cancer Institute and other entities in that effort as well. And then I'll just lastly pitch in that so what I would call sort of diagnostic technology, going beyond DNA sequencing and RNA sequencing, has just exploded as a field. I mean, our ability to actually put sensors up against cancer cells in a laboratory, I'm saying here, and understand what makes them tick and what their therapeutic vulnerabilities might be. There's just been mind-blowing advances within just the past few years. And so whereas TCGA was kind of a mind-blowing advance in its time, in 10 years, we've added on top of that tools that are just incredibly powerful in terms of zeroing in on this issue of therapeutic vulnerability, but they have to be applied to uveal melanoma. So it's kind of a redo of the conversation we had about TCGA in terms of rolling up our sleeves as a community and figuring out, well, how do we not just pull together the resources as Sarah nicely highlighted, there were challenges in terms of launching the TCG effort that actually are going to be even a little bit more challenging to overcome, to leverage the tools that I'm talking about now. So skipping over the technical details, like we need that. We need to actually keep up with these sort of profiling technologies if we're going to be able to really I think precisely define what it is that we need developed in terms of new treatments.
From my perspective, just listening to Keith and thinking about the discussion about the Vision Registry, I think the Vision Registry can help catalyze some of what Keith you're talking about in some really innovative ways. And I think industry is already involved. I think advocating for industry to be involved and help bring resources in at the next level can hopefully help us build upon this foundation of Vision Registry to help drive some of what you're talking about. And I think by doing that, that also puts patients squarely at the center of that research and advancement, and allows patients to kind of direct their information, their data, if you will, into advancing the field. And I think that that's a really exciting opportunity that we're kind of just on the edge of being able to do. And building, and currently in talks with a number of different partners about building in some tools into the registry to be able to advance in those ways.
Just to add to that, when you look at $2.1 million in research that Curom has funded, over the years, a good chunk of that money has come from patients and what we have done, whether it's a Miles for Melanoma or homegrown events. We need to continue that. The registry is not going to just stay afloat. We need to be able to fund that and bring as much money to that as possible. It's a tough advance. We're not getting, the funding from, X, Y, and Z that's just going to throw a couple of $1 million at us. It's coming from us. It's coming from the patients. We need to continue that effort.
If I could just add, this morning was extraordinary to listen to Dr. Patel, Dr. Orloff, and Dr. Carval talk about both adjuvant and clinical trials in the States. And I wasn't aware that there are several really important and significant new initiatives just in the past year. So there are lots of clinical trials available. Yes, there are issues around, access and how far patients have to travel to get to them. Our score with ocular melanoma clinical trials in Canada is currently 0 and fairly settled at 0. So it seems extraordinary that there's just this imaginary border between the two countries, and yet we haven't been able to bestir ourselves, to work closely enough with cancer centers and pharma companies to make sure that we're moving the needle up. And I think it's always about, trying to move the needle up, trying to get more help for patients within the context of continuing to be civil and compassionate and loving. And I think that's what Curom has really brought to us all.
Okay, thanks everybody. And that's Nigel, I appreciate it. That was an excellent segue to what I would love to conclude with. Of course, I'll leave the floor open if anyone wants to contribute anything else. But throughout this year of our anniversary, we've talked about one central theme, and that theme is hope. We say that hope changes everything. So in each of your roles, we have here represented patients, caregivers, researchers, physicians, truly what makes up Curom. So in each of your roles, what is it that motivates you and gives you that hope? What keeps you at it each and every day?
I mean, thanks, Adam. I know for me, it's the relationships that I've developed over the last 15 years. Unfortunately, I've lost count on how many people I've lost from the OM community over those 15 years. It motivates me to continue to educate, to raise awareness, to raise money, so that I can stop losing friends. I mean, that's really a lot what it comes down to. It's just, I looked at, the graphic with the, the 10 on it and people's pictures and how many of them are not with us anymore. And that's what keeps me going. That's what keeps me motivated.
If I could maybe add too, as a patient, I have survived for a long, long time with this horrible disease that seems to sweep everybody away. And I was registered for hospice in January 2013. But here I am. There's nothing, there's definitely nothing special about me, but I have made it through to today, which is a beautiful day. And I just hope that more and more people will be able to stay and pitch in and make us a stronger community.
Yeah, hard to add to that, but I'll do my best. I mean, two things, I guess. One is that I entered the field in the year 2000 with a focus on melanoma of all varieties, and heard for 10 years that melanoma was basically never going to be toppled as a disease. And here focus on cutaneous melanoma. And you look at the advances made in the past 10 years and the fraction of our patients who survive a metastatic diagnosis now. Many of my colleagues outside of the melanoma field say it was truly to them unimaginable, but it's not only been imagined, it's been done. So I just, as much as I acknowledge that this type of cancer marches to the beat of its own drummer compared to cutaneous melanoma, it's just, it's hard for me not to carry the same conviction into ocular melanoma research. And I know that all of my colleagues who joined today and those who couldn't join today feel the same. So there's just a really strong sense of motivation. But the second point, my final point, is that when I entered the field in the year 2000, we didn't have a concept of team science in cancer. We just didn't exist anywhere in any type of cancer, any country. It just didn't exist. Everything was done at the institution level, and there are so many reasons behind that, but that's the way things were done. And that has changed, thankfully, not in every cancer community, but it has largely changed. But for reasons we've already discussed, and this is kind of the real point here in terms of hope, the ocular melanoma community has really come together, doctors, researchers, and patients, in a way that's really quite unparalleled, and for a rare cancer type particularly. So the synergy there is absolutely positively going to pay off. I have no doubt about that. We all need to maintain a strong sense of urgency. I can't imagine anybody in this conversation today doesn't have that feeling. But I do have hope by virtue of the fact that the partnership has been forged. We just have to keep our eye on the prize and keep pushing from here. There are challenges, we've touched on them, but they can be overcome, particularly if we stay together.
It's amazing to hear all of you talk. And I think, Adam, I think there's two parts to the question you asked. And the first one makes me emotional, which is what keeps me going. And then I'll speak to the part about what gives me hope. And I think they're related. But I think one of the things that keeps me going, to be honest, is the ability to look at Greg's and my daughter and to tell her and to show her what it looks like to take a challenge in your life and make it better for the next person, and to really be able to live that out and to be able to look her in the eye and feel that Greg and I put our best effort into doing that and taking, one of life's greatest challenges for us and trying to make the world a better place. So I think that's one of the things that keeps me going, and knowing that that was a goal of Greg's too, and to be able to do that for Greg and our daughter and for the community. I think, intertwined with that, what gives me hope, I think, are the three other people on this panel with me today. And just, the sense of community that we've spoken to today. And it's just an amazing, evolution and transformation to go from the sense of fear and isolation that I talked about, Greg and I feeling in 2006, to now feeling a part of this robust community that is changing the world. I mean, there's just nothing that can create more hope than that, I think. And so to, the clinicians and the researchers who have been a part of this meeting, and those who haven't been, but, have just contributed to this disease and advocate for patients every day, and to patients not just surviving, but thriving, like Anne-Marie and Nigel and others, and giving back so much to your communities. I just think that, we're gonna see a huge difference in these coming years. And I think we're all gonna feel it, and we're gonna not have empty chairs at future patient meetings and at Thanksgiving dinners. We're gonna keep those chairs full. I know we'll do it.
Thank you all. I can think of no better way to sort of close this session. But at the same time, as we close this and we celebrate our first 10 years, it's truly a rededication to the next 10. And the hope that's going to drive us into what we will accomplish next. And we will truly fulfill our purpose and the mission that's in our name, to cure OM. So thank you all for participating. I appreciate you sharing your Saturday with me. And if there's nothing else, then I will close the session. And I believe we'll move on to Sarah to close us out for the meeting. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you all. Well, thank you all. Can you hear me okay again with slides up?
We can, Sarah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and for being a part of this movement and this effort. Really appreciate everyone sharing this Saturday with us, or those of you viewing later, taking the time to view hopefully what are informative and helpful sessions for you. I also just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors. As you heard, really throughout these sessions, the advancements in this field, it takes, a huge village of stakeholders, and our sponsors are really important partners to getting all of this work done. I also just want to mention that, we have a wide range of patient support and education materials. You've seen some of these slides over the course of this meeting. Please go on our website, curom.org, and you'll see the wide range of patient educational materials. If you don't see something that you want, please reach out to us. We're always trying to update materials and make sure that the materials are helpful and relevant to the community. So please feel free to reach out to us if you don't see something that's helpful. And you can email us and get any of these materials for free sent to you, either as an individual or a clinical office to hand out to patients as well. And then just a reminder that we do co-host a number of support groups, which are virtual, and we're always open to exploring the idea of additional support groups if needed. So again, this is hopefully a dialogue with the patient community. Please don't hesitate to reach out to us if there's a resource you think would be helpful for the community that you don't see offered currently. And then a reminder that hopefully we will be back in person in Florida in partnership with Moffitt Cancer Center, April 1st through 3rd, 2022. It will just be a huge opportunity, I think, to reconvene as a community in person at that time. The meeting will be hybrid, so if you aren't able to travel, for whatever reason, we are going to make sure to have a virtual component. I think that's the way of the future. So we're really excited to bring more information about that to you, and we'll be soliciting the patient community for topics that you're interested in as well. And then maybe lastly, a plug for the Vision Registry. As you've heard throughout the past couple of days, the Vision Registry is only as powerful as we are in the numbers of patients that we can bring together and look at the data. So please go to visionregistry.org, reach out if you have any questions. We're happy to walk you through anything, and really appreciate your participation and feedback. And lastly, just to thank you all for joining. Thank you all for being a part of the past 10 years, helping us get to where we are today. And please reach out, be in touch if you need anything, and we'll see you in April. Thank you so much.